Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on our session, which is entitled The Universal Right to Social Protection by 2030, How Responses to COVID-19 Reveal Potential Humanitarian Pathways to Support National Social Systems in Managing Climate Risks. My name is Dr. Megan Bailey. I'm a manager at the Red Crescent Climate Center, which is a specialist institute within the Red Cross movement that provides support on climate risk management. I lead our work on social protection and health. As a few points of housekeeping before we begin and before I introduce our fantastic lineup of speakers, I'd like to say that we've got a chat and we'll be putting in resources that are relevant to each of the presentations as we go. Please do write your questions as they come to your mind. We'll address them towards the end. And if you'll bear with me, I will spend just 1 minute explaining the general definitions around social protection. If you are like me a few years ago, when I first started working on social protection, I was coming really from the humanitarian side on climate risk management, and moving into social protection was a very different world. And so just to ensure that we're all on the same page, I'll give it an explanation, and apologies if this is very basic. But social protection are programs that aim to reduce poverty and vulnerability. I think the easiest way to think about them and understand the way that they differ from development programming by NGOs or humanitarian interventions is to think about them as falling within one of three categories. The first being social assistance, so programs like cash transfers, public works, school feeding programs, these kinds of programs that you likely have seen in your work in a humanitarian space. There's also social insurance programs. I myself benefit from many social insurance programs like maternity supports, also child benefits. These are programs that are generally contributory, so you pay into, sometimes through taxes. And the point of these programs is to really help with the ups and downs and the shocks of life. And the final category is labor market programs, so things like trainings, wage subsidies. These three categories offer very specific kinds of support. They're generally implemented by national governments, and in that way they differ in some ways from general humanitarian intervention. They offer a unique opportunity to reduce climate risk. So we know that climate is having an effect on exacerbating poverty, inequality, and disparities. It does so in a multitude of ways, primarily through these sort of slow incremental changes in climate that often negate the benefits of livelihood outcomes, different livelihood options, and income generating activities, making them less productive, and also through extreme events. So we know that extreme climate events, we've been seeing loads of them in the last few months, cause great damage, have acute losses. And the combination of those two, these slow incremental changes in climate that draw down on coping capacity of populations, as well as extreme events that incur significant losses and disruptions, the combination of those two over time serve as a real multiplier effect that exacerbate poverty and inequality and the disparities that populations experience. And social protection interventions that fall within these three categories, the social assistance, social insurance, and labor market programs, they offer a unique entry point to supporting these populations. And we'll discuss throughout the session about the way the humanitarian actors can support that and align that. I'll stop now and introduce the first of our three speakers. The first is Valentina Barca. She is the team leader on social protection. The program is called Social Protection Approaches to COVID-19, which has the fantastic acronym of SPACE. And I will leave it to you, Valentina. She's going to talk us through the experience of COVID in the past year and what we can learn from it. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Megan. And I really like that you started with that statement. I have benefited from social protection. And I think that's something that we often forget. We often give it for granted in high-income countries, and that is exactly its power, that we only notice it when it's missing. So again, how many of you have a parent who's receiving a pension, maybe even those of who haven't worked in the past, friends and family who've maybe received disability or caregiver allowance. You probably know a friend or two who've lost their job during COVID-19 and they've been receiving unemployment benefits, wage subsidies. And we take it for granted in the same way that we don't notice the floor that we walk on. And that is exactly why in this sector we refer to it as a social protection floor, because it gives you something stable to walk on. It accompanies us in those life cycle risks that Megan referred to. And they're not just a safety net that catches us after we've fallen. And in fact, many of us rightly see these as an entitlement. And in fact, this is a right that is enshrined in Article 25 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where it is very clearly stated that everyone has the right to an adequate standard of living, and specifically the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his or her control. So for those of us who've been working on social protection for many years, COVID-19 has actually been fantastic from some perspectives, and this may sound cynical, but it's been an opportunity to finally get the world to understand why this sector is so important and what our day jobs are. Kind of friends and family finally understand what we do. We've been repeating for many years that we're all vulnerable to many overlapping shocks unless there's a system to support us. Kind of the COVID-19 crisis has really been driving this message very, very strongly. So how did social protection play out with COVID-19? That's kind of, my team has obviously been following things very closely because we were almost a helpline for governments and country partners to be kind of having quick discussions on what priority actions could be, how the social protection sector could be responding. We've been working in over 40 countries over the course of the last 2 years. And the big headline figure is that in 2020 alone, 200 countries and territories had invested over $800 billion in more than 1,400 social protection measures. And that's gone up to 3,333 in May 2021. So this is obviously pretty astounding. It's significantly more than during the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. But the real interesting story is in how countries' experiences really varied quite drastically depending on the social protection programs and systems that they already had in place, how much they'd been investing in social protection as a sector. So just to help you break that down a little bit, if we think in terms of the programs that countries have, so that's one important dimension. Many high and middle income countries that have a high percentage of formal sector employees obviously leverage social insurance that Megan has kindly been explaining, and active labor market policies extensively. So you've all seen extensive use of unemployment insurance and wage subsidies in many countries. And obviously these sometimes weren't sufficient. There were people who were left out. There were a lot of adaptations to bring in people who might have not been previously protected, and some use of social assistance, of course, to kind of as a residual support for anyone left out. Now, in many low middle income countries and low income countries with very high levels of informality, and I'm sometimes talking more than 90%, obviously that there was the potential in some places to use social insurance to some extent, but obviously covering very small percentages of population. So in no way that was sufficient to be supporting, just given the amount of people in need. And you probably in your experiences, you've really been following this closely. So these countries were cornered into using non-contributory social assistance measures, and each and every one of them have been building from the programs that they had. So one important thing to remember here is that where there were countries that already had very high coverage, and I'm especially thinking of child grants and social pensions, these already cushioned people from the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. So where social assistance was already quite high coverage across different population groups, obviously the impacts were cushioned. And there's a growing number of studies that have been showing this in detail. And for you as humanitarian actors, this is obviously anticipation at its best, in the sense of a system that is already in place protecting people. But even where coverage was high, but also where coverage was lower, there was still a need to be expanding. And that is partly because in no country the social protection sector truly caters to the whole population. There's a big issue of what we refer to as the missing middle. And once again, the story shows that the more, sorry, my son, it keeps going in the background, the more there were programs and capacity in place in advance of the shock, the easier it was to swiftly expand caseloads by leveraging existing systems, by building on what was already there. And there's a huge number of examples from this perspective coming from South Africa, Namibia, Indonesia. You'll be hearing from Pakistan, hopefully, when we solve the connection issues, and a huge number of countries around the world that did this. And this brings me to the second point on systems. So I was talking about programs before, and now I'm going to refer to systems. And this is really important. So that the strength of social protection goes beyond an individual cash transfer, an individual program. It's more about how multiple programs are working together to address those different life cycle shocks and covariate shocks that people might be facing. And across those different programs, there's also some underlying building blocks that work across all of these, and they enable programs to reach those in need when in need effectively. So what do I refer to when I'm talking about systems? I'm talking about at policy level, the social protection, the policies, the strategies, the legislation that really mandate the sector to be performing, the core financing for the sector, the functional and technical capacities of people at every layer of implementation. Are there people kind of sitting at community level that can be supporting and for example, registering new caseloads? I'm talking about approaches to coordination within the sector and beyond the sector. Obviously, for you, the humanitarian coordination is really important. I'm talking at design level. I'm talking about the capacity to really generate the evidence that can strategically inform how social protection programs are designed, understanding risks and needs, including needs deriving from climate change, the triggers, and kind of deciding who should be targeted and why, and transfer values, etc., based on that information. Obviously, in a constant tango with the extensive trade-offs and the very different forms of accountability that governments face compared to humanitarian actors. And then all the way down, I'm still talking about the system, all the way down to operational level, where we're talking about the capacity to implement sometimes quite complex programs that reach thousands, if not millions of people at any given point in time. So this is fundamental. It's often hinging on some strong information system, some interoperability with other government databases, and it's hinging on the capacity to be registering people, to be enrolling them, to be providing payments to huge amounts of people across a country, case management, grievances, kind of the list is long. So where those systems were stronger, they were extensively leveraged in the COVID-19 response. And there's quantitative analysis that my team has performed just showing how significant the differences was in terms of countries leveraging existing data were on average 60 days faster. Countries leveraging existing electronic payment modalities were on average 40 days swifter than others. And obviously this is where I expect some of you as a humanitarian audience might start fidgeting and asking, great, fantastic, you've been talking about countries that had quite developed systems that did okay, but what about countries where social assistance was less strong, where social protection wasn't really there? And of course, this was the case in many countries and especially fragile conflict-affected states. And there were definitely many situations where government struggled to play any role at all or played a bit of a waiting game with the humanitarian sector. There were others where government did quite big things almost independently of a humanitarian actor. So I'm thinking of the introduction of the new Bucks Nano program in Somalia, for example, catering as a social safety net for its population. But crucially, I think in the COVID response, we've really seen the fruits of years of the grand bargain pushed coordination in terms of that push for sectors to work together to achieve joint outcomes. And what we saw and what was really fascinating for us kind of who were watching this closely was really how that collaboration across social protection and humanitarian actors wasn't black or white. It wasn't all in or all out. It was strategic collaboration, building on the relative strengths of each sector along each and every piece of the building blocks that I was referring to before. And it was about coordinating capacities in terms of who could do things better or maybe support. So maybe the humanitarian sector had expertise in data-informed geographic prioritization where risks were the highest, supporting with boots on the ground in terms of registration, market analysis, support to setting transfer values. And in some cases, we saw a lot of coordination in terms of caseloads. So humanitarian actors picking up populations that had somehow been left out by government responses in terms of migrant and refugee populations, displaced populations, urban areas, but not doing this separately, but really coordinating with the social protection sector in doing this. And there's a fantastic compendium by the Grand Bargain subgroup that really goes into the details of many examples, including Madagascar, Malawi, Jordan, Ethiopia, Pakistan. There's many in there. I would really recommend having a look. It goes into the strategic collaboration during COVID across sectors. And I think the bottom line message is we saw long-term relationships and trust built over time pay off in the COVID response. Where the two sectors had started collaborating before COVID, things really kind of moved quite swiftly and much more effectively than if each sector had been working on its own. And just as one example, in Madagascar, the Cash Working Group was set up under the leadership of the government, the ministry in charge of social protection, together with the National Agency for Disaster Risk Management, led the work and coordinated different actors, pushing towards making sure that the short-term emergency response was aligned with the medium-term national vision. And this we've seen in country and country again in the COVID response. So just to close from my side, I wanted to close with a bit of a metaphor. So I was saying that we take social protection for granted, and something else that we take for granted is a mother's love or a father's love, but I'm going to refer to a mother because I'm a mother myself, a mother's love towards her children. So I'd like you to just close your eyes and imagine the social protection sector as a mother who has a protective obligation towards its population. So it's a duty of care towards her children, towards her population. And things might get overwhelming at times. Emergencies happen. Sometimes you're not able to pick up a child at school. A mother might call in a family member, a babysitter to help. And those are other government pieces that work together with the mother to support her. And I'm thinking about your disaster risk management agency, for example, supporting in emergencies nationally. And where things go very wrong, you might, where maybe the mother doesn't have the best care of her child at heart, she may be detrimental to the child in some way. That's where you have your social services step in. And in a sense, obviously I'm pushing things here, don't get me wrong, but in a sense that's your humanitarian sector. And that is my plea to you is to be social services that is sort of supportive to the mother to ultimately be able to take care of her child rather than taking the child away or kind of stepping in for good, not being intrinsically suspicious of government systems, not undermining trust in government, and really pushing the boundaries of the concept of doing no harm, extending it to the concept of doing no harm to existing systems that are there to protect and support people in the long term. And I'm referring to social protection systems. So I hope I didn't offend anybody with that. I'm sort of, sometimes analogies work from this perspective, and I'm happy to discuss details further, and I'll be sharing a few useful materials in the chat as well. Over.
Thank you so much, Valentina. I really loved that metaphor, actually. I got maybe a bit too relaxed with my eyes closed, kind of kicked back into gear now. But yeah, that was a fantastic overview of how social protection systems have been used in this really unprecedented time. And it's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, who will go into more detail about one of those countries that was able to operationalize their social protection. So hopefully all of our connection problems will be resolved or have been resolved. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Sania Nishtar from Pakistan, who's a senator. She is the Special Assistant to the Prime Minister of Pakistan on Poverty Alleviation and Social Protection, part of a federal minister from the government of Pakistan. Can I hand it over to you, Dr. Sania? Thank you so much. And she's going to talk us through the specific experience of Pakistan and the use of social protection during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks. I think we still haven't quite fixed our connection issues. I'll just give it, I'll hold my breath one more minute and hope. Dr. Nishtar, we're not able to hear you. It's quite in and out. Perhaps try switching off your camera, and perhaps that will help with the bandwidth. Awesome. No, it's not. I think try again. Let me listen one more time. No, I think maybe we should move to. Oh, you can hear us. I think if it's all right with you, Dr. Nishtar, we'll move to our third speaker and then hope to come back. And perhaps we could try connecting via mobile phone. So hopefully we'll come back to you. Our next speaker is Ralph Rodemaker. He's the head of Global Program Social Protection, Innovation and Learning from GIZ. And he's going to speak to us about USP 2030, both the initiative and the goal, and get us riled up for this incredible and important ambition within the social protection space. Over to you, Ralph.
Thanks, Megan. I indeed hope we get a connection to Sania Nishtar because she has such great stories to share from Pakistan. That would be really, really lovely. Thanks, Valentina, for the great start, which you, as usual, took us to. And indeed, I recommend everybody to look at the great work which Space has done in terms of analysis and so on. So it's just interesting publications and very hands-on which came out of that work. So big kudos for that great work. I wanted to use the opportunity to talk to you about USP 2030, which I'll explain to you in a second, because connecting to the point which Valentina made, we've seen that countries which essentially had much more established social protection systems were able to respond to the COVID crisis much better. So basically, the bottom line is the better the social protection system, the less the need for humanitarian action, which I think is in our mutual interest. So the logic is the following. We have the SDG 1.3 setting the target to implement nationally appropriate social protection systems and measures for all, including floors, and by 2030 achieve substantial coverage, it says, of the poor and vulnerable. But essentially the vision is that everybody has access to social protection as and when in need. And to phrase it more in a more catchy term, we coined that as universal social protection. And to put some steam behind this ambitious goal, there is even a global partnership being formed, which is called USP 2030. And I'm sure Valentina will post a link for that as well, or I'll do that later on. And there are a varying degree of or various members, from governments, UN, donor organizations, but also civil society, and from the humanitarian sector, we have UN players like WFP, UNICEF, FAO, several NGOs like Save the Children, Humanity Inclusion, but overall on the NGO side, rather few with a humanitarian focus, which is a pity because not the membership itself is important, but because we need to be overall aligned and need to create spaces where we essentially strategize on how to work jointly on certain elements. I think the grand bargain approach has been very useful, and I think this needs to be furthered. We're talking about lessons from COVID here. We are talking about climate justice. So what we know, and that's certainly not news for you, is that we are facing an increasing number of shocks, and people, more and more people are living in fragile contexts, and that will lead to more pressure on the humanitarian actors and government systems alike. And if shocks are eventually part of the new norm, we need to, as much as possible, transit response to these shocks into the norm systems, right? So this is also where, you know, the circle closes to the anticipatory action. But while we have about 20% of the humanitarian crises being predictable, we only have less than 1% of the humanitarian funding assigned to anticipatory action, and that despite the fact that we know that intervening earlier to prevent shocks, to prevent shocks from becoming a crisis is the better approach to take. There are, and as a social protection guy, I don't want to talk about an anticipatory action overall, but there are elements which, from risk analysis and mitigation measures, the preparedness response, there are these activities in anticipatory action, disaster risk reduction, forecast-based action, early warning, early action, whatever name you want to give it, with the overarching goal to essentially really be better prepared, which we from the social protection space term as adaptive social protection. And there we are looking essentially from two sides at the same coin, right? And so we are working on the system from both sides, and the humanitarian sector is a strong ally for us from the social protection domain to bring the vision of universal social protection alive, and also to make that happen even in settings which are increasingly affected by shocks and which are fragile. We know that an increasing number of the population of the world will be living in fragile settings, so we will be having much more of such situations to deal with, and to try to incorporate that into our new norm. So what I want to encourage is a purposive contribution from you as the humanitarian actors to building a social protection system. So we are basically looking at the elements which Valentina also mentioned in terms of the system approach, where we have building blocks around, building better coordination and policy, defining on how the DRM domain and social protection domain interact and implement where there are gaps, identify these gaps, define who is responsible for which part, and how to do that better, where we integrate early warning systems much more coherently in both systems and define who's taking which share later on, and essentially really fill the gaps more purposive so that nobody falls through the net and is left behind. Where one would be looking at coherent payment systems, which ideally would, even once established in a humanitarian response, really be transited also into longer lasting systems, and as much as possible have systems, from social protection which you can expand and which can be used and be brought to more horizontally, essentially expanded and brought to more people, where we jointly work on strengthening the resilience of households and interventions in order to make sure they get through the next shock better. So what I'm trying to say is we have 9 years left for the ambitious SDG targets. And in these 9 years, we are about 4 billion people short of bringing them under a social protection system. And 4 billion is a lot, is more than we have actually covered so far. So I think what we need to what we certainly need is all hands on deck, and all hands on deck means it needs to have a close partnership with the humanitarian sector in order really to reach everybody and to leave nobody behind. And so I'm very keen to have fora like these to really operationalize in countries, operationalize, but also globally strategize on how we can create synergies across the sectors, if you so wish. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ralph, for giving us that oversight of the vision and also the urgency, the 9 years. That's a very tangible, small amount of time to reach this goal of universal social protection. I'm holding my breath if we can now hear Dr. Nishtar through Tina, a very helpful technical support.
Tina's still muted, so maybe that's the...
Okay, try now. Sania, you need
Can you hear me? Okay, all right. And now as well? Okay, excellent. So first of all, apologies, and I'm sorry that this little glitch happened, but technology is unpredictable, and the Murphy's law is that whenever you need it, it ditches you. But I'm glad we were able to connect, and thank you so much for this invitation. I thought I should speak to you about 4 things. So firstly, what is the overall social protection context in Pakistan? Secondly, the COVID response. Thirdly, how COVID has changed our response to social protection. And the fourth phase, how does it intersect with the climate change agenda? So are you happy with this categorization into 4? So taking up the first agenda to begin with, social protection was a priority for the government much before COVID hit. So in 2019, when our government took over, the government announced that social protection is going to be its priority, and essentially the non-contributory, and that we would start with the non-contributory social assistance. And in support of that, a very large program was set up. The program's name is SRS, which means compassion in our local language. SRS is a multifaceted program. It's got 19 programs for 14 different target groups. And there are 292 actions in support of program execution. There are 34 agencies executing the program. And it's got the largest budget ever in the history of the country. So it's the largest social protection program our country has ever had. And in order to execute this, we developed a new ministry, because we have a devolved federal polity. Social assistance is a provincial subject. So the federal government, and Germany is a federal government as well, So, despite this being a devolved subject, the federal government took responsibility. It created a new ministry, new institutional arrangements, and in 2019, we spent a lot of time building the digital infrastructure to help upscale the program.
There were new policy frameworks developed, new institutional frameworks, a new strategy, a new 5-year strategy in support of SRs, and a longer-term vision. A new survey was mobilized. And in addition to these, building the blocks,
we started work on these 19 large programs. So what the point I'm trying to make is that we were on an accelerated path even before COVID struck. And some of especially the digital execution engine, we procured a new biometric payment system, we installed a mechanism of data analytics and even used that for cleaning up our list. We installed SMS gateways. And then in February of 2020, COVID struck. In Pakistan, we have a very large informal economy. And our labor force survey, basically, we commissioned a quick microdata analysis of the labor force survey. And we found out that there were about 22 million breadwinners that either worked in the informal economy or those that were daily wage earners or those that earned a piece rate wage. And this very large cohort of 24 million workers were the ones whose livelihoods were very badly affected because the economy came to a grinding halt. Intercity transport was suspended. There were these laborers who were in large cosmopolitan cities where they earned a daily wage, were not able to go back to their villages. And the country was really at the verge of a humanitarian crisis because 24 million times 6, which is the family size, you're talking about half the country's population of this very massive, of the 5th most populous country in the world. So the government gave us $1.25 billion to execute a cash program. And what we basically did was that we pulled a thread through our existing digital capabilities. And there were 3 things that were brought into play. The first one was the biometric payment system. The second one was a demand-side SMS-based request-seeking mechanism. And the third was a new wealth profiling data analytics mechanism. So we pulled a thread through these 2 things, through these 3 digital capabilities to develop a delivery mechanism. So the front-facing communication in this program asks livelihood affectees to send their unique national identity card numbers on an SMS short code. Because in Pakistan, everybody has a unique national identity number. And we had these mass campaigns during the first lockdown, and we said everybody should send their identity card numbers on 8171. That became popularly known in this country. And as a result of that, we received 139 million requests, of which 66 million were unique. So 66 million in a country of 200 million. So a massive mobilization. Now, once the SMSs arrived, we adopted a hybrid targeting approach. So we used existing survey, but because the surveys were very old, the socioeconomic surveys, we used data innovation. So for the first time, big data analytics was used for the decision making in our country. Because Pakistan's 13-digit unique identity number is linked to information about travel, taxes, billing, asset ownership, and government employment status. So we use these as wealth proxies for eligibility asset payment. And during that initial period of the lockdown, there was massive communication on a daily basis. So we had to explain to people, your SMSs have arrived, we are analyzing them, you have to wait for 3 weeks. And once we analyzed them, then we sent them out messages asking them to collect their money on campsites where commercial banks had set up their biometric payment system. Now, the system had its limitations, but it was end-to-end data-driven. It was fully automated. It was rule-based and transparent. And it was also politically neutral. Now, you would understand that in a federal polity where you have different political factions governing different subnational units, there are always political tensions about who gets what and whether it was politically neutral or not. But because it was all data-driven, there was huge acceptance. And what we saw cascaded on the ground were millions of people with mobile phones in their hands, with confirmation SMSs, collecting their payments at thousands of campsites all over the country. Now, and when they would go to the campsite, their biometric signatures were verified in real time from the National Database Registration Authority, and once they were authenticated, people were paid the equivalent of $75, which we believed would be enough for them to buy the rations. Now, we believe this mass-scale assistance really averted a major humanitarian catastrophe. And that is where the lines between humanitarian assistance and social assistance become so blurred, because during times of disasters, social assistance and humanitarian assistance is basically one. And we labeled this program as a SARS emergency cash. And with great humility, I would like to say that when the World Bank did its final analysis, ours was the fastest deployment globally and the third largest in terms of the percentage of population covered, following the US and Japan. And India was fourth in terms of percentage of population covered. This was in Duco Gentilini's report, which came out about 2 months ago. And for our country, this is really a watershed moment in terms of government functioning, because it really fast-tracks the adoption of digital execution within the government and new ways of coordinating with multiple stakeholders. Yesterday, I was speaking at the World Bank ministerial conclave, and I explained to them that the system that came into play during COVID was something we developed in 2019. And once our digital capabilities were in place, I was sharing with other ministerial colleagues that that I would convene these 8 a.m. morning meetings, and I would draw how this would play out. And my colleagues were not ready to go so far out from what was the convention. And they said, this is too out of the box, this is too risky. But when COVID happened, we really had no choice, and we just brought those 10 mind maps out and said, well, now or never. There are millions of people out there at the countries at the verge of civil unrest. This is our chance of executing. And it really averted a humanitarian catastrophe. Now, this was not because we were executing the biggest program in the country's history in the most direst of circumstances. So there were lockdowns in it. There was a huge amount of cash movement when effectively there were curfews imposed. We were doing something new and novel in the remotest parts of the country where connectivity and logistics became a problem. The system was data-driven. So in many cases, you ended up giving notifications to dead beneficiaries. I recall the first day I was on radio, there was a woman calling saying, my father's died, but I've got a notification saying, my father is the one eligible in the household, and receive the money. Because the system works in such a way that when the SMSs hit the databases and they were filtered out and the messages went out in the queue, and if a person was dead and had not reported in the database, we had no way of ascertaining that the person had died. So if that was the person eligible to get the money, the SMS would go in that person's name. And if the daughter had SMS also, she would get a message saying your father is eligible. So on the go, we had to explain to people what the limitations of data-driven messaging were. And there were a whole host of other limitations related to financial literacy, to low financial literacy, to low digital literacy, which we have to we had to develop workarounds. And then, of course, we had to be very agile with the decision making. I recall a few weeks into the execution, the retailers who were working in our campsites went on a strike saying, we are executing for you in a very difficult environment, and you are charging too much commission on our payments. The government is charging too much tax. So, and of course, the tax that was levied, there was a percentage of the federal government, there was a percentage of provincial government. And it was a long story of how, on a daily basis, we had to make different calls and convene different provincial cabinets to get waivers. This whole account of how it was conceptualized, what the methodology was, how it was rolled out, what the execution challenges were, is something that I've written in a report, and I recall every day during that execution when I'd come back home, I'd write a piece of that story. Because I knew when that time was over, I wouldn't remember that very well. So I'm very happy to share that report with you. It's in the public domain now. And of course, there were several learnings from this massive execution. There were learnings for other countries that utilize unique personal identification systems, because our experience showed that by combining cell phone messaging, which is operational everywhere, internet connectivity, unique numbers, and the capability of commercial banks, you can develop a demand-based during times of distress for the purpose of emergency social support. So essentially, this mechanism also contributes to building resilience at scale. The second thing that from a systems perspective was a learning was that technology by itself is not panacea. Technology by itself cannot execute for you. It has to use technology in a system, and it is how you combine policy innovations and partnership innovations with systems innovations and intelligent use of technology that allows you to execute well. And thirdly, that you need to draw on the competencies of many sectors within the public and private world, even within the government system to execute it at scale. Especially our experience from executing a SARS emergency just showed us how cash transfer programs can be deployed to counter the socio-economic fallout of COVID-19, which from what it seems presents a long-term predicament. Now, with this, I'd like to come to my third point, which is after COVID. Now, after COVID,
thank you so much, Dr. Nishtar.
We were very consumed with the execution of COVID-19 and this massive large-scale deployment. But as soon as our cash transfers for the 15 million households were over, we came back to the drawing board on the execution of SARS. And as I explained to you, SARS has 2 actions in support of the 19 programs. One of them is a constitutional amendment which guarantees the right to social protection. Because in our constitution, the right to social protection is in the principles of policy. So it's not a justiciable right. And we want to move it into the enforceable section of the Constitution. That's item number 1 on the list of 293 actions in the SARS umbrella. So we are moving the constitutional amendment. There are legal frameworks that will elaborate. The work on that is commenced. We have successfully brought to fruition our new National Socioeconomic Survey. It has just concluded. We've now got geotag data on 38 million households, which will really bolster our ability to target. We're developing a new democratic data around the National Socioeconomic Registry, allowing different organizations.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nishtar. It was fantastic just to hear the example of
I'm just afraid
I think we were able to scale up so quickly and to such a magnitude. I think the example of Pakistan for COVID-19 it shows us what is possible when there is the energy put behind it to do it. And I think it's this kind of energy and commitment that we'll need going forward to manage climate risk through social safety net programs, through a wide variety of social protection mechanisms. We're going to move on to questions, but just before we do, I wanted to share one last personal experience. Thinking, because one of the main questions we want to answer is, what is the role of humanitarian actors to support these programs? And from my own work, we've been trying to integrate climate information into social protection systems in particular, and working closely with various countries' national programs to develop scalability mechanisms, so sort of indicators on once you reach them, you would, with the vision to scale up and support a greater population. This has been building off of the early warning, early action work that has been done by many institutions within the humanitarian space, particularly World Food Programme, but also well across the Red Cross movement and FAO, and to integrate that early warning, to be able to do things earlier, to initiate movement earlier, in order to scale up, but also for contingency planning, to be able to have social protection programs that are able to implement their payments without disruption, to really use that climate information and the wisdom of humanitarian actors to integrate that within those programs. Finally, with that small example of how at least we within the Red Cross Climate Center have made that small contribution to the operations of a number of social protection programs globally, and hopefully will continue to do so in the future. I'll open it up to questions. I will move to the main stage. Oh, okay. There's a question from Alex Semba for Ralph. For countries such as Malawi, where you have done commendable work on social protection, what would you say are the gaps that remain in the national system that need to be urgently attended in order to achieve USP 2030? It's a multi-part question, but I will leave it for you, Ralph, to start that, answer that bit first.
Yeah, well, it's certainly not easy to answer. Malawi has taken a very interesting development over the past few years in terms of expanding social protection, but also in trying to bring the humanitarian and the social protection sector closer. Essentially, was a recognition of saying we have a recurring food crisis every year, where the humanitarian sector is responding year and again, in different magnitude and partly very large magnitude, and saying, we need to try to find ways of trying to, use existing data better, of trying to build on existing payment systems, and so on and so forth. And I think that, trying also to expand existing social protection systems, which isn't entirely easy because the data wasn't compatible. But there is, or there has been, interesting movements and discussions. There is also the challenge of, particularly if you talk about climate risks, there are many actors involved in government, so we need to really try to orchestrate many. And I think there is no silver bullet of saying, from one year to the next one, we'll solve that problem. Valentina pointed to the fact, where there has been dialogue and the effort to try to work together before it, it is solved gradually better every year. And I think we need to see it as a part of a journey of not saying, we need to discuss a system until, everybody thinks that's going to be the silver bullet, and next year we just shoot that one and that's the end of it. We need to basically continue doing the experiments in terms of payment pilots as were done in Malawi in terms of vertical and horizontal expansion, of trying to, have a discussion about the do we pay benefits in terms of food basket or other transfer values, which is simply a discussion where, sides need to converge. And I think in Malawi that has started to work. A big step was anchoring the ambition to respond to shocks in the social protection strategy, as a shock responsive social protection approach, but also in trying to bring the preventive elements in and trying to bring the resilience building elements in. Now the big obstacle for Malawi is, on the one hand, securing sufficient funding to go at scale in a country with such high poverty rates, and to really bring the operational infrastructure and backbone out. I mean, we do need to realize that the delivery channels are at times shaky, at least. I think that trying to bring the strong capacity of the humanitarian consortium in Malawi and the other actors into that and fill gaps is a way forward, and that journey has started in Malawi, and I think that's really rather promising. But still a way to go, so I'm not saying there is anywhere close to the end.
Thank you very much. If we could be permitted to answer one more question, unless we get kicked out of our session. I just had one that I was hoping to ask Valentina. Very straightforward. If humanitarians want to learn more about entry points into social protection, where should they start? And what do you think are the biggest bottlenecks for humanitarian actors to support SP systems?
Yeah, that's again not an easy one for a 1 minute response, Megan.
Sorry.
Yeah, I've been posting a lot of publications in there where you can definitely find more depth in the answers. But if there were one entry point, I would say start that conversation, start speaking to the various counterparts in the governments of the countries where you're working. Don't see government as a unitary block. It is not government, it is several ministries, kind of each with their own mandates and working on different programs. Sometimes social protection actually spans several ministries. Start those conversations, start understanding the sector, how it operates, the constraints, put yourself in the shoes of the people sitting in the ministries, understand where their constraints come from, the challenges that they're facing, where their frustrations are, how you could be complementing that expertise. Very often in the social protection sector, again, you have fantastic, very driven people, even maybe if the rest of government might have its problems, kind of people sitting in social welfare ministries are often really have their heart and dedication in the right place. Sometimes we focus too much on kind of core idiosyncratic risks. So helping that to shift that conversation to understand broader covariate shocks, the shifting landscape of risk with climate change and the role it's playing, how social protection could be just those small design tweaks, those small changes that we could be performing on routine programs to just improve their effectiveness in terms of both resilience building and the potential to be scaling in response to shocks. And yeah, start that conversation would be my key point. It does pay off, and we've definitely seen that with COVID.
Thank you so much, Valentina. A great point to end on. And apologies everyone for some of the